Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's Franke Visiting Fellow Lecture for the spring semester. I'm Gary Tomlinson. I'm the director of the Whitney Humanities Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here. The Franke Visiting Fellowship is named after Barbara and Richard Franke, who often are sitting in the audience for these talks, but right now Barbara and Richard are enjoying a warmer climate somewhere very far from here. One of our two Franke Visiting Fellows for this year is Stephen Meyer, and it's my pleasure to introduce him today. I'm hearing the voices from the heavens somehow. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Meyer today. Professor Meyer teaches English and American literature and English and American literature and modern intellectual history at Washington University in St. Louis. His specialties traverse a wide range, including 20th and 21st century poetry, and also the relations of literature and science. In the first of these areas, 20th and 21st century poetry, he's currently writing a study of the work, likewise wide-ranging, of African-American poet J. Wright, and I believe you're working with Beinecke manuscripts. Are there manuscripts here in the Beinecke? Yeah, excellent, in the Beinecke Library. But it's from the second area, the relationships of literature and science broadly conceived, that his talk today is drawn. He began developing this area years ago in a book on Gertrude Stein that analyzed the impact on her innovative literary practices of her turn-of-the-century training in physiological psychology at Radcliffe and neuroanatomy at Johns Hopkins. And this work on Stein drew Professor Meyer to the thinking of American psychologist and philosopher William James, and Anglo-American mathematician and philosopher Alfred North Whitehead. A second book that Professor Meyer is working on now, alongside the study of Wright's poetry, is entitled Robust Empiricisms, Jamesian Modernism Between the Disciplines, 1878 to the Present. It examines expanded empiricist practices that have built on James's and Whitehead's joint approach, and it takes in such perspectives as those of Belgian philosopher of science Isabelle Stengers, French sociologist of science Bruno Latour, and British literary critic and poet William Empson. These interests have also resulted in an edited collection of 2018, the Cambridge Companion to Literature and Science, in which Professor Meyer gathers the work of like-minded scholars working at the borders of science and the humanities. In all this work, Professor Meyer sets himself to step beyond the old two cultures dichotomy of C.P. Snow, not to deny the real differences of Snow's distinct sweeping approaches to the world, science and humanities, but to reanalyze the terms of the dichotomy, to re-energize the synergies between those terms, and to understand a history of interaction between them that reaches back long before Snow and his Cold War atomic age concerns. All of this is of huge interest in itself, but it's particularly interesting at the Whitney Humanities Center, where one of our signature programs is the Franke program in science and the humanities. Please join me in welcoming Stephen Meyer.
So I want to start by expressing my gratitude to Gary for creating such a constructive and welcoming environment at the Whitney, and more particularly for inviting me to spend this year here. Before I say anything more, Maria Rosa Menecal was a very close friend of mine, and so it's kind of awesome to be having her listening to me right now. This is the only place she could be listening to me, but she might be. So I'm especially grateful for the opportunity to deliver today's lecture, which builds on the Cambridge Companion to Literature and Science, which Gary mentioned and which I will wave in front of you. Just so you see it, it contains some fantastic essays, and a difference between it and what I will be presenting today is they're all finished. It took me a long time to get them all finished, but I am satisfied that they possess that quality. And what you're going to hear today is not finished, so it possesses a different quality. It possesses its own quality, but it's a different one. Today's lecture builds on the companion toward a large project that I have not directly been working on at all this year, which Gary mentioned a few details about, but which is always on my mind. no doubt even when I'm sleeping, though I'm not always aware of it when I'm sleeping. But I'm very aware of it when I'm awake. A study of the joint investigations of the late 19th and early 20th century philosophers William James and Alfred North Whitehead, who together with researchers across the disciplines, including the literary critic William Empson, the evolutionary developmental biologist C.H. Waddington, the mid-century American philosopher Suzanne K. Langer, as well as central figures in contemporary science studies such as Bruno Latour, Donna Haraway, and Isabel Stengers, form an important lineage that I call Jamesian modernism. The talk will focus on three practitioners of expanded empiricisms, and Gary mentioned a comparable phrase, chiefly the authors of a pair of books that came out in 2016, literary critics Branka Arsic and Angus Fletcher, linked in the presentation, if nowhere else, by recent work of Latour's. Only Latour is, strictly speaking, a Jamesian modernist, yet by a fairly unproblematic stretch of the imagination, Fletcher fits the rubric, and there's considerable overlap with Arsic's findings, if not so much with her approach. And I want to say again, this is because it's a work in progress very much so. I appreciate criticisms. I appreciate any thoughts you may have, even more than usual. The title, The Two Silos, points to a still broader topic, indicated by a couple of highly suggestive propositions that may serve as epigraphs. From Emerson, to put science and the soul, long estranged from each other, at one again. And from Fletcher, our hard task is to respect the song of the earth. Now I should mention there's a handout at the door, so if you don't have it, you can sort of gently go find your way, get one copy, and I'll indicate when it's relevant. As you'll see, this is one of those instances where the handout is probably better than a PowerPoint. Frequently, organizational and intellectual divisions in the academy are spoken of in terms of silos, jargon apparently imported from programs in management studies. Several years ago, the Cambridge-trained social anthropologist and Financial Times correspondent, that's a columnist now, Gillian Tett, published The Silo Effect on, quote, the peril of expertise and the promise of breaking down barriers, close quote. Easier said than done, if experience in the academy is any measure, given that the broad embrace of interdisciplinarity in both the humanities and the sciences somewhat counterintuitively might well have made the situation worse, even more experts covering ever more specialized domains of expertise. It is still possible, however, to be a generalist. Just last month, I happened on a piece in the New York Review of Books by Peter Brooks. You can see him right there. The founding director, as it happens, of the Whitney Humanities Center. He directed the center between 1981 and 1991, and again between 1996 and 2001. The NYRB review was of a volume entitled The Storyteller Essays, which collected Walter Benjamin's famous essay, The Storyteller, together with related material by Benjamin and excerpts from texts that, in Brooks' phrasing, had talismanic value for him by writers inseparably stitched into Benjamin's thinking. In addition to Nikolai Leskov, the Russian novelist and short story writer, ostensibly under discussion in the essay, these included Georges Lukács, Paul Valéry, Ernst Bloch, Johann Peter Hebel, Herodotus, Montaigne. In somewhat leisurely fashion, Brooks presents Benjamin's argument in the essay regarding, as he sees it, the death of storytelling. That might be surprising to you. The death of storytelling and the concomitant art of listening, which followed the shock of the Great War. Alongside the fairly traditional claim that, quote, death is the sanction of narrative, close quote. In other words, quote, it is only with the end of a life that its meaning becomes apparent. Benjamin's preference for the oral tale over the novel is duly registered, as is the increasingly apparent threat to both tale and novel. Information is Brooks' term for this. The editor of the volume speaks of data. We all know those terms all too well. In passing, Brooks refers to, quote, Benjamin's sleight-of-hand transitions, surely the great gift that Benjamin passes on to his readers. Guided by the title of my talk, you may have detected some irony in the proposition that it is still possible to be a generalist. Such was the implicit assumption of the New York Review, however, when I worked there back in the mid-1980s, and I certainly would not have questioned it then, barely noticing that the operative criterion for the generally excellent reviews of popular science and of work in the humanities, that they be presented in a manner accessible to the university-trained common reader, pretty much guaranteed minimal interaction between the two silos. They were both on the same page sometimes, but there was no conversation other than what you might register reading them together. More obvious was how the distaste of the editors of the New York Review for theory kept many compelling developments in the Academy off the pages of the journal, with the recovery of Benjamin a notable exception. Yet in one respect, he was no more true generalist than Brooks. For how much engagement with the science of the day are you likely to find in their writings? That there has in fact been tremendous overlap between the sciences and the humanities in years past, and that this continues to be the case, is perhaps the great discovery of science studies in the adjacent field of literature and science over the past half-century. Although, like the discovery of the Americas back in the day, this statement is at best half-true, since the greatness of the discovery only holds for the discoverer, not for the discovered, who have been there all along, or almost all along. C.P. Snow was dead wrong when he posited two separate cultures, literary and scientific. Science studies and literature and science, even more pointedly, demonstrate that every day. Yet there was and remains a long tradition denying the overlap. The battles of the books between ancients and moderns, natural philosophers and humanists, preachers and scientists, so nicely described by Stephen Jay Gould in his last work, The Hedgehog, the Fox, and the Magister's Pox. Now, the three works I'll be discussing today are all examples of literature and science, yet aside from that, they are quite different. The first, Arsich's Bird Relics, Grief and Vitalism in Thoreau, remains squarely in the humanities silo. The second, an essay co-authored by Latour and the Earth System scientist Tim Lenton, doesn't mention literature at all, although it was published last year in Critical Inquiry, one of the leading venues for the theoretical humanities in the US. It identifies itself as, quote, a journal of art, culture, and politics. There's no science in that mix, unless you want to mash it in under culture, right? Which is not the whole story. And certainly not in the essay I'm going to be discussing. The third work, The Topological Imagination, Spheres, Edges, and Islands, which the title doesn't seem to suggest a strong literary purchase, right? Contains, in fact, intricate readings of works of literature, although these are probably fewer in number than we might expect from its author, who devotes a great deal of space to the science of topology, informing his speculations about human existence on Earth. Generically different as they are, I'll be proposing that the works by Latour and Fletcher, the author of the third work, Angus Fletcher, cease to be located in one or the other of the two silos, scientific and literary or humanistic, and instead operate in the pluralistic reaches between them. In a pair of lectures delivered in 2005 in Amsterdam and reprinted in the volume The Lure of Whitehead in 2015, Latour introduced a related figure for his preferred approach. Instead of building a bridge between two shores, a common enough figure for interdisciplinarity, and also instead of inhabiting the space between or around two silos, he chose to describe his mode of investigation as that, and some of you will be delighted with this, others will be somewhat confused, as a kayaker, subject to the vagaries of the river between the two banks. With this figure, he reversed the order of the various forms of investigation. Instead of escaping from already built silos or building a bridge between pre-existent banks, he was exploring the activities of the waters that had molded the banks themselves. Before proceeding, I should note that there seem to be four general classes of investigation within literature and science. Although the field has developed in the aggregate from the first to the fourth, there's actually no set chronological order where individual instances are concerned. Arsich is therefore a good example of the first, demonstrating the influence of science on the humanities. That is probably how most people unfamiliar with the field think of it in its entirety. Yet already by the late 1970s, work by Latour and Donna Haraway, for instance, had reversed the arrow, and features associated with a broad understanding of literature were being used as interpretive tools for understanding science. In Latour's case, this involved the role of writing in experimental practices, in Laboratory Life, co-authored with Steve Wolgar, and in Haraway's that of metaphor, in Crystals, Fabrics, and Fields, subtitled, quote, Metaphors of Organicism in 20th Century Developmental Biology. Beyond these two unidirectional varieties of influence study, okay, the first and the second, one finds work that attends to the mutual imbrications of the sciences and the humanities. No doubt in works like The Order of Things, Foucault gave a huge boost to such investigations. In literature and science proper, this resulted in studies that took as their compass the idea of a single culture, which included both of Snow's two cultures. Important works by on Darwin by Gillian Beer and George Levine are paradigmatic of this second wave. But logically, a monoculture is not the only alternative one might take. Instead, there may be many ways of linking the sciences and humanities, none of which dominates the others. This form of multiculturalism has a particular appeal for someone like me who has chosen to work within the framework of Jamesian pluralism. I'll remind you of the title of one of his books, A Pluralistic Universe. Although that framework is hardly necessary for literature and science to operate essentially as an interfield, with multiplicity proliferating as it does today. In any case, read the book. Okay, you'll get a good sense of that. In any case, both Latour's and Fletcher's works fit fairly comfortably within that framework, and there is room for non-pluralistic investigations as well as part of the broader pluralism. So, on to Grief and Vitalism in Thoreau. This is a remarkable book and received the MLA James Russell Lowell Prize for the outstanding book of 2016. So, as I'm using, the framework again, I want to remind you is that this book and the Angus Fletcher book came out the same year. Not only did they come out the same year, they came out from the same publisher. Not only did it come out from the same publisher, they had the same editor. They're remarkably different books. So I think that mostly goes to say that the editor was, in fact, somebody who had a very Catholic, broad set of possibilities in his head. I'm using it, that is to say, I'm using Arsich's book as my example of a work that, despite appearances, does not actually challenge the two silos rubric. But because I'm going to be doing that, I want you to be sure that you appreciate some of its many merits. I mentioned Peter Brooks's review of the Storyteller essays for several reasons, and one of them is that if, as Lindsay Waters suggested recently, he's in fact the editor of both of the books, Benjamin functions these days as something like a patron saint in the theoretical humanities. This is surely due in part to the romance with the archive at the core of so many exciting literary historical efforts, and figured for so many of us by the Arcades Project. Several months ago, I picked up a copy of 2119 in a local bookstore, Barnes & Noble. And actually, I have a question for you, because I realized I didn't know how to say 2119. I think it's 21 bar 19, because there's a line between 21 and 19, okay, which is technically a pipe. Computational analysis is called a pipe, or sometimes it's called a vertical bar. But the last thing you want to say is 21 vertical bar 19. So I think 21 bar 19 might have gotten this visual image across. I'm curious. Does anybody have an alternative to that? Because I realized I didn't know how to say it aloud. Anyway, okay, good. So I'm as far, I'm with the curve, if not ahead of the curve. So I picked up a copy of this book. It is subtitled Contemporary Poets in the 19th Century Archive, edited by the Thoreau scholars Kristen Case and Alexandra Manglis. And it covers similar ground to our search. So just to give you a sense of just how much this is of the moment. Only there is so much more of it in Bird Relics. So let me briefly describe the experience of reading Arsich's book and some of the argument. Early in Bird Relics, she describes her method, which she calls affirmative reading. Essentially, she wants to go with Thoreau as far as he will take her. And to do this, she eschews critique and judgment. And more importantly, as she explains, she finds his, quote, strange ideas deeply suggestive, but that doesn't mean that I have to believe in what he said, close quote. Okay, that's the affirmative reading here. Effectively, she reads him by willingly suspending her disbelief, okay, as a tool to take her places. In other words, if you don't willingly suspend your disbelief, this is what Coleridge was talking about when he coined the phrase, right? You just say, that's crazy, and you stop reading, and you stop thinking. Okay, we live in a culture where that is, of course, the dominant mode, right? And this is, as far as I can tell, the only way to get around it. But you have to, in fact, then live in a world in which poetry is part of that world. Because for Coleridge, at least, right, this is how he characterized what he called poetic faith, which was willingly suspending disbelief, okay, which is very different from suspending belief. Okay, it's just about your skepticism and not letting it get in your way. Okay, so Coleridge proposed this when you encounter very strange material in poetry, such as zombies, because many of us encounter them outside of poems. Now, he calls this, again, poetic faith. Thoreau is strange enough anyway, right? But Archis makes him even stranger. And strangeness is one of her key terms. She uses the phrase over and over and over again. And of course, there's a long tradition with that term. Strange things happen in Thoreau, she begins. That's the first line of the book. She makes him even stranger because she has, quote, tried to treat all of Thoreau's utterances as if they were meant literally. Okay? This is a work against figuration. Anytime there's something that looks like a figure, let's take it literally. Okay? Now, I take it that in this regard, as in a good many others, Archis is engaging quite directly with the philosopher Stanley Cavell, who, in fact, when you leave today, you walk down the hall, on your right, you'll see a poster for a conference on Benjamin that was in this building, and he was one of the speakers. Okay, so it's a very small world. A great reader of Thoreau. An author, before that, of the classic text, Must We Mean What We Say? And so I take it that Archis is engaging that question and saying, with Thoreau, he means what he's saying. Okay, and he means it literally. Quite amazingly, reading Thoreau in this manner results in an extremely consistent account. And I say that's not what I would expect. If I stopped reading things that are written in an apparently figurative fashion and read them all literally, I would think I would be all over the place. Not so, in her hands. This is strange, except for another feature of Arsacich's practice. For in addition to reading Thoreau in any number of archives, where his voluminous manuscripts are stored, many of which have not yet been published, or she has a tropism towards the ones that you can only read in the archive. She also reads him by reading what he read, right? Fairly traditional practice. Hers is a source study of a very high order. Greek dramatists, pre-Socratic philosophers, accounts of Native Americans, and, this is why I'm speaking about her book today, more than 100 amazing pages devoted to the very strange scientific texts to which Thoreau was exposed at Harvard and which he continued to devour into the 1850s. In these works, she finds incontrovertible evidence of his broad exposure to what she alternately calls vitalistic materialism and materialist vitalism. A strain of vitalism that in turn focuses his grief at the death of his brother John in 1842, which in her accounting is the definitive event in his life. Okay. One might call this the undertone of the book, except that it rings on every page. The juxtaposition of Thoreau's brother's death and the materialistic vitalism produces in Arsacich's single-minded but undeniable reading a remarkable theory of grief. Combining what she terms eternal mourning with a reframing of the traditionally fairly sharp divide between life and death. So the two brothers continue to share the same material vitality, even as this continuity between life and death is extended to any number of levels of experience. It isn't just these two guys. It's at all levels of experience and of materiality for Thoreau on her account. So one of the most exhilarating things about Arsacich's study is her capacity to find similar claims in the most various places, until she goes too far, at least for my taste, when she aligns Thoreau with none other than Walter Benjamin, even as she extends the figure of the archive, tweaked some, to multiple levels of Thoreau's world. It's certainly not the monomania that I object to. Obsessive is another positive term that she relies on throughout the text. But with Benjamin, Arsacich, in effect, breaks the fourth wall. So as she manifestly does not do with Thoreau's own reading, which is limited to his actual reading, contemporaneous, and in particular with the role of science in her argument. The Darwin she refers to is a very thin Darwin. 20th century evolutionary theory is strictly neo-Darwinian. Okay? Many people might think that's what it is. There's a whole school of literary science studies that has been critiqued by a faculty member very effectively at Yale, which has a very thin notion of Darwin that they apply to everything. But they are also working with a Darwin that's long out of date. She has no sense and no interest in the extraordinary developments of the past 150 years in the sciences. Of course, she is not writing about post-Civil War anything, except that she is. Okay. So at one point in the book, she lists a number of vitalists, philosophical vitalists, whom she sees coming out of the Thoreauvian lineage. Among these figures, she includes Bergson, possible. I mean, not directly, but nevertheless, maybe there's an overlap there. She lists Gilles Deleuze, the late 20th century French philosopher, who is undeniably a vitalist. All right, and she lists William James, the American psychologist and philosopher whom Gary mentioned. So there's a problem here. James is no vitalist, even if Bergson is and Deleuze is. Now, Arsich expressly identifies Thoreau's intense empiricism, which is a phrase she adapts from somebody else, and it's spot on, with James's radical empiricism. And she has a fascinating argument for how to do that without, I don't have time to give it to you, and it's simply, it works, but it's actually not James. Okay? She therefore interprets James so that he conforms with her vitalism, hers or Thoreau's. And remember, it was supposed to be Thoreau's only. But at this point, she's become a spokesperson for this in a way that she had suggested early on she was not prepared to be. Moreover, there is no trace of Thoreau's brand of vitalism in 20th century developmental biology. There was in sort of precursor work among his contemporaries. None at least, now if you know anything about developmental biology, you may say, hey, that's not true. There was lots of vitalism. But none at least after the new organicists offered an often in Whiteheadian inflected account in place of the mechanistic or vitalistic accounts that battled in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This, of course, would be irrelevant had Arsich stuck to her strictly historical time frame, as she adamantly does with science, but not with philosophy. The discipline where, following Cavell, she locates Thoreau most firmly. So what was happening in the early to mid-20th century that put vitalism, admittedly more traditional vitalism than Thoreau's, to one side? For that tale, one only has to look at the book by Donna Haraway I mentioned earlier, her Yale dissertation, in fact, on the emergence of in Anglo-American embryology of what Haraway, drawing on Whitehead, calls non-vitalist organicism. Now again, I don't have time to go into the details of this, but the following contrast should give you a sense of what I take it has happened. In reference to a work from the mid-19th century, incredibly interesting work by Robert Hunt called The Poetry of Science, where he's trying, in fact, to bridge the arts and the sciences. It was a key work for Thoreau. So in reference to that work, Arsich writes, science around 1840 was of the opinion that the division of phenomena into organic and inorganic, right? We sort of vaguely know, reasonable sense of what that might be, didn't coincide with the distinction between animate and inanimate, okay? Because everything is animated. That was the science that Thoreau was reading. So the difference between organized and unorganized was not animation, but complexity. But the organized and unorganized, right, are all animate, regardless. So to get a sense of how things had changed by the 1930s in embryology, all you have to do is flip it. And so Whitehead developed a concept which was then picked up variously by the embryologists, which he called organic mechanism, which was designed to sort of split the difference between the organic and the mechanistic. But it was not, again, vitalist. Right? So what does that mean, not vitalist? It means that everything of sufficient complexity is organic, whether it's animated or inanimate. So it's exactly the opposite of the perspective that Thoreau would have had in the mid 19th century. So again, all I'm suggesting here is actually there's a really interesting conversation to be had between the Thoreau of 1840, 1850, and the developments in embryology, which actually occurred in the 1930s, but have only recently really taken off, because embryology and developmental biology was largely ignored within the modern synthesis of molecular biology. And so this is a very interesting tale. And that's why, in fact, her work is fascinating. So I have no doubt that Arcius is spot on in describing the extremely strange world in which Thoreau lived. In fact, I am quite prepared to accept that that strange world is also the world we actually live in. All right? There's a wonderful story that Bertrand Russell used to tell, or told in one place, about being completely shocked by his close colleague, Whitehead, when Whitehead said, "The difference between you and me, Bertie, is that you think the world really is the way it is at high noon, with sharp edges. Whereas I think the way the world really is the way it seems to us when we're waking from deep sleep. And we then construct a sharp-edged world." Okay? And so that's a comparable vision of reality to Thoreau's vision of reality as conveyed by Arcius in her book. But it is my objection to Arcius's argument is then that she comes across as arguing for Thoreau's vitalism rather than, as she tells us she will, right, suspending her disbelief. And so what I would want to ask her to do is to suspend her disbelief about his vitalism, but not necessarily regarding so many of his remarkable observations. For there are alternate accounts of these, and which don't diminish them in various ways. And so if she took science more seriously, not just Thoreau's reading in science, amazing as it is, she might take her commitment to what she calls literalization. She might limit her commitment in order to allow metaphor greater play than she does. I think there's a connection there. Okay, now. I'm actually, I don't think there's time right now, so I'm going to leave aside. I gave you two handouts. The first one, the cover of the handout, is from a 1909 French illustrated journal with an article about the true shape of the globe. And so this is just an example of not exactly a traditionally spherical image of the globe. And it is, I found it with when Angus Fletcher's first lecture that he gave in this new project at the time of his, which ended up in the book that I'll talk about briefly. It was a lecture at the Mellon, it's not museum, what is it? The Mellon Center in LA, where he was a fellow. And they had this picture in their collection, so they just used it. Okay, the second handout that I've given you is a very rare copy of a very rare pamphlet that was published in 1947, which by a friend and supporter of Gertrude Stein's, after her death, her partner Alice Toklas sent, Robert Haas was his name, sent him some pages from a work of hers where he was in fact talking about, where she was talking about him. And so in this description, that I gave you, he recalls a passage in a work of hers called The Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, where she is describing an encounter between herself and Ezra Pound, the poet, who had moved to Paris and had been a frequent guest of hers at her apartment. And then on one occasion, she didn't like him. She made this famous remark about him that he was an excellent, really a village explainer, which is fine if you're a village, but not if you're not. So she thought of him as just basically a second rate. But he happened to sit on a chair that she had, a couple of chairs, which are at Beinecke. The chairs are at Beinecke. So material culture. And two children's chairs, 18th century French children's chairs. And he sat on one. He wasn't very big, but he was too big, and broke the chair. And subsequently, the chairs were repaired, and Alice Toklas stitched some patterns that Picasso had sketched for her. And so that's what you would see at Beinecke. But before that, Pound destroyed one of the chairs, and he was exiled from their fetes. And so Stein, in this book, recalls meeting up with him. Stein is writing this in the third person about herself. So he met Gertrude Stein one day near the Luxembourg Gardens and said, "But I do want to come to see you." He's not happy about his exile. "I am so sorry," answered Gertrude Stein. "This you don't have. But Miss Toklas has a bad tooth. And beside, we are busy picking wildflowers." All of which was literally true, like all of Gertrude Stein's literature. But it upset Ezra, and we never saw him again. Now, how is it literally true? They're picking wildflowers in Paris? She's just dismissing him with something that, an excuse, right? Literally, Toklas may well have a toothache. But the non sequitur is this other thing is not literal. Okay? So I'm just giving that to you as an example of the complexity of the literal as a mode of analysis. There's a much longer story, but we don't have time for that. So I'm going to wrap up and just say the essay that I'm going to present of Latour's. Now, was anybody here at the 2014 Tanner lecture that he participated in? So a couple of you, several. And so that's the last time he's been at Yale. And he spoke about how to better register the agency of things. And this is, in fact, has continued to be a concern of his. But it's taken a direction that I suspect those of you who were there at that session might not have imagined. He had already delivered the Gifford lectures at in Edinburgh the year before, which were then published in English in 2017 as Facing Gaia. He's become a kind of climate science, I don't know what the word is, I would say fanatic, except that that's the right thing to be. So we all should be such fanatics. This book, however, is not his strongest work, because what he was doing there was training himself while he was speaking to the public. Okay, and so that it's very interesting, but you've got to want to read it. It's not going to make you read it. Now, however, in 2018, published in France in 2017, a little book called, translated in English as Down to Earth, was published by him. Fantastic. So I mean, it's a superb study of where we find ourselves right now. And so I highly recommend it. Now, the essay that I cannot tell you strongly enough how fantastic it is. That was published, as I say, in Critical Inquiry. last spring, which is called Extending the Domain of Freedom, or Why Gaia is So Hard to Understand. All right? And it's co-authored. As I say, it has nothing to do with literature. But the reason why I would want to include it under the rubric of literature and science is because it's by somebody for whom his literary engagements are always in the back of his mind. And they're informing his engagements with the sciences. So when one is in this form having to sort of dig fairly deep, but just to give you a little sense of what's involved here, because I really want to promote it. So part of the problem with understanding the concept of Gaia is that it was developed by two scientists, James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis, who were working at opposite ends of the scale. So the notion of Gaia is important for Margulis because who's working with microorganisms, whereas Lovelock is working with the entire Earth. And so it's just how difficult it is to do genuinely interdisciplinary work when you're that far apart in your focus. So it's not that they're not talking about much the same thing, it's just that it's hard for us to grasp it, right? It's that kind of training. It's that kind of training also, and again, because I want to stop and hear something from you, it's that kind of training also which, in fact, Angus Fletcher is determined to develop in himself and hopefully in his readers. So where he differs, it would seem quite emphatically from Latour, is Latour wants you to know this about Gaia, among other things. It is not a sphere. Okay? In fact, Gaia is not the planet. On Latour's interpretation, Gaia is something called the critical zone. And what Latour was doing shortly after he was here at Yale in 2014, later in that year, I was actually at a lecture, a seminar he was giving, and he said to us, I got it. His glee was impossible for him to restrain. He had just been given a grant by the European Cultural Association to run a consortium of 23 teams of scientists in Paris looking at various problems around climate change, one of which was, in fact, the critical zone. Now, what is the critical zone? Okay, so let me and I'm going to close on this, but it is to give you just a quick sense. For Latour, with his background, with his training that he's managed to pick up quickly, he is describing something that he cannot actually, he hasn't been sufficiently sensitized to it in as much as he cannot see it as having anything to do with spheres. Okay? It is a critical zone and not spherical. Whereas what Fletcher is in fact doing in his entire book is trying to give us a way to approach through the mathematics of topology the way that in fact, although we live on a two-dimensional surface, which is, again, it's not exactly two-dimensional, the critical zone, so the critical zone is maybe 14 miles, but it's almost as if it's a surface relative to the size of the Earth. So he's trying to give us a sense of how to imagine what our experience actually is. And it's just too, he says, I can't do it. But he's trying to get us sensitive to this. Latour is doing that in his own way. But I'll stop there, but I'm happy to answer any questions. Okay, thanks.
Before we take any questions, I wanted to tell you that there is a reception downstairs afterwards. Please, you're all invited to come. It's in the room right underneath this room, down the stairs and down the hall. Questions?
Yes.
So you mentioned that Thoreau read for pleasure, the cutting-edge science of his time.
Mm-hmm.
This is something that is very difficult for a person in the humanities to do. Right? In fact, even from one discipline of science, it's very difficult to appreciate what another discipline in science is doing. A couple of years ago, several hundred professors were asked to list their formative books. And Diana Eck, when she wrote the preface to this book, made this very interesting observation that many scientists had cited books in the humanities as formative books. But the reverse was not the case, that no humanities professor cited a scientific book as having been a formative influence in their careers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So to me it seems that at least today, may not have been so 100 years ago, but at least today, this conversation or this appreciation is really unidirectional. That it's not bidirectional. So would you like to comment on how this influences this knowledge?
Absolutely. So part of that is, I think, the sort of self-selection of humanities professors as such. In other words, if you take, for instance, are you going to include Latour as a humanities professor? A lot of science studies is really, and this is another synonym for science studies, is sociology of science. Now, with one of the directions that this has gone with Latour and his peers is that what might ordinarily be considered obvious, which is that the sociology of science is about scientists. Because we tend to think of sociology as a human-centered discipline. But the sociology of science is nothing like that, as it's been practiced over the last 30 years. And Latour has been probably the major person in transforming the approach. And the approach is, let's go look in the lab and see how things get done. And this is the connection to his more recent work on Gaia, and see where the agency is, where it lies. And the agency is often in the interactions between either the scientists and various things in the lab, or between the things with the scientist only coming in at a certain point. So now this is in fact part of the way I would answer your question, because I think you're right in that in our training in the US, most scientists come out of college, thankfully, with a sense of acquaintance with literary works. And literary works are actually incredibly exciting things, and they can change your life. And so it's going to vary. Sometimes it's going to be science fiction. So one of the transformations in the field of literature and science was when people started taking the effects of science fiction on scientists seriously. That is simply opening up minds to possibilities that might not have ever occurred to one. But then there are many, many other ways in which literary works, humanistic works can, so to take an example, another example, Stephen Jay Gould, who I mentioned. So Gould is a great paleontologist and a great sort of theorizer of paleontology, right? He has said many times, did say many times, he could not have done what he did if he didn't go talk to his colleagues in the history department, who had all sorts of ideas about how history functions within a human context that he was then able to think about and think with in thinking more in terms of paleontology, fossils, and so on and so forth, right? So there it's quite obvious. And it's bound to happen quite frequently because of our educational system. On the other hand, frankly, and please correct me if you think this is an overstatement, Other than individuals who work in science studies or literature and science, very few humanities professors will have had a good time with the sciences. Especially, and again, this is something that's happened since Thoreau, it's a huge factor, the mathematization of sciences. Thoreau was not a mathematics whiz. He was okay, and he obviously has fascinating things to do with calendars and so on and so forth, so he had an interest, but it's almost always very creative. And now, much of really the entirety of the 20th century into the 21st century, if you're going to be engaging with contemporary science of your period, you pretty quickly have to get comfortable with the mathematics that's involved. It doesn't mean you have to be a mathematician, since physicists are not as good mathematicians as mathematicians are, or they tend not to. You don't have to. You know the mathematics you need to know. You haven't just simply been stunned into the glories of mathematics as such, right? So again, somebody like, a great example is Snow, who was a physicist and was a pretty good technocrat and a pretty good engineer. And he, in the Two Cultures essay, he makes fun of pure mathematicians that he thinks are worthless. So, that's, I think that's a big part of the answer, but it's not the case. I'll give you a very simple, Gertrude Stein, who I work on, was by no means a great scientist. She was well trained. I mean, almost all of her courses in college were in the sciences. She went to Johns Hopkins Med School. But I would never make a claim that she's an innovative scientist. But I do make the claim that her exposure to the sciences played a transformative role in the kind of writing that she ended up producing, which nobody could figure out.
Could I address Gertrude Stein?
Excuse me?
Could I address
Please,
Gertrude Stein
please,
and her
please.
Science training. So have you investigated her record at Johns Hopkins Medical School? And under what circumstances did she leave Hopkins?
Yep.
So you have Gertrude Stein was accepted at Hopkins on the recommendation, I believe, of James. She came there. She was a very, very poor medical student. And she was able to fly through the school just on the basis of a reputation. Howard Kelly, the head of OBGYN, was the first person who, at the end of her obstetrics training, said to her that she had performed so poorly that if she wanted to continue in medical school, she would have to repeat the obstetrics rotation. She responded to that, at least the quotes I've seen, by saying, "Thank you very much for forcing me to make a decision I've been unable to make on my own." She went off to Paris and she never returned. So I don't know how much science she really learned at Hopkins. My suspicion is that perhaps she didn't learn very much.
Right. So I have to beg to differ. You want to know the full story, you need to read the chapter in my book, which is all about her experience at Hopkins in neuroanatomy, where she was, in fact, did very interesting, not major work, I would never make that claim, but there were transformations in the field that she was exposed to that had, I believe, a formative effect on the kind of writing that she ended up doing. Now, in terms of Kelly, there's an additional factor that you didn't mention, which is that from all the research I did, he was strongly anti-Semitic. And he would not give her a passing grade, in part because she was Jewish. So, there was a whole brouhaha about that, trying to figure out what to do. And she really wasn't interested. By then she had lost her interest anyway. But when she started at Hopkins, she'd finished everything again, as you said, she made it through, except for one course at the end. And she was at some level grateful because she wasn't enjoying what she was doing. And it's sometimes hard to persuade yourself to get out of a situation like that. But it was not as simple as you're saying. She was actually doing extremely interesting work, and there have been all kinds of claims made that people don't know what they're talking about. And so I would be grateful if you would look at the chapter in my book and see what you think.
I think before condemning Howard Kelly, I would look at Howard Kelly's life. He may have been anti-Semitic. He was probably the most highly respected obstetrician in America. Mm-hmm. His life, even outside of medicine, is truly.
I have no reason to doubt that, but I'm saying it can't be used as an explanation for why Stein, in fact, did not do well with him.
Okay. Can I ask you one other question?
Mm-hmm, sure.
That, you stated that stories have disappeared. It turns out that, you know this probably more than I do, narrative medicine has become a field of its own. Mm-hmm. And so the entire center of narrative medicine is the story of patients' lives. So if one considers storytelling and story listening, mm-hmm. and they are stories that cross between what are the humanities and what are the sciences as well. Perhaps storytelling and story listening is alive in the profession that actually represents the meshing of the arts and science world.
Mm-hmm. No, you may not have heard me when I actually suggested that this might surprise some people in the room to hear this. I was using that as an example by a leading humanities scholar who founded this institution, who was continuing a line of argument that Benjamin had made in the 1930s. And now, it's a more subtle argument than that for what's involved, and it has to do with oral storytelling specifically, and a certain kind of oral storytelling, a certain notion of wisdom, and so on and so forth. So it's a somewhat different argument. Same words, but not the same thing. Thanks. Yes?
I was really struck as a Franke representative by your story about the Stein chairs, which I had never heard. I had never heard that Pound had broken one of those chairs. And to me, those chairs, sit in a particular space. They're contextualized in a way that is almost entirely removed from Stein and Tocqueville, except for their provenance history. So they're they live on a tour of the Beinecke, and that's my primary engagement with them as an early modernist with very little understanding of what Stein was doing. But this brings me back to your almost in passing description of the romance of the archive in relation to Benjamin. And I've been struck in your talk by the transtemporal nature of many of these readings. And one of the things I wonder about in that is where almost in a conservator's fashion, where one fixes a particular reading and how one goes about situating a particular reading in time. In much the same way that, say, when you're going through to fix a building or going through an archive to fix a point, you might choose one period, one shade in the layers of wallpaper as the point at which you stop, disregarding the others that also exist and also have their long inheritances. And so I was struck, say, with Coleridge, and that poetic faith comment, I think came out of the different, I could be misremembering this, but I think came out of his different lectures on Shakespeare and the different editions of this when he was talking about reception. I could be misremembering.
He's actually, it's in the Biographia Literaria, and he's talking about how he and Wordsworth divided up the poems in lyrical ballads. And then he says the way we did this, and this is the link in some way to Arsich's focus on strangeness. He said, I took the subjects, the topics, where you had to sort of make the strange seem ordinary. to the reader. And Wordsworth took the poems where the problem was the opposite one, where the reader might think this is just ordinary life. It's not interesting as a subject matter for a poem. And so Wordsworth's assignment, according to Coleridge, and of course this is very mediated by their history, but Wordsworth's assignment was to take ordinary things and make them strange. And it's in that context that he then starts talking about the willing suspension of disbelief, which happens when you have something that seems very strange.
And so it's exactly this point, because Coleridge is such an unreliable, such a shifting narrator, right? And the versions of what Coleridge said in his lectures, or the temporal identity of how he read things, changes so much. But I wondered, just in drawing together these different readers in your argument, how you situated the text that they were engaging with, or their reading itself, and the within the sort of archival framework that those ideas might be subject to flux. And that's an unanswerable question, but I'd be really interested in just hearing how you think about that idea of like fixing a reading, particularly when you're reading across time this way. And I was really interested in the earlier question about humanists reading science and scientists reading humanists, because I've had that experience of trying to, as a very humanist, trying to engage with Newton's Principia, which is just utterly impenetrable, not least because of the mathematics, but also because of the, it's written in Latin. So there's a way in which one can read Newton, but still never read Newton. And I wondered if you had thought about the specificity that an archival perspective might require for this kind of engagement with readings. And it's just out of curiosity to hear what you might think.
I'm still trying to get a full handle on this, and so you might explain it in a different way. But the overall perspective here, that, and again, I was the idea here, and you didn't get the full picture, so you didn't get much about Fletcher at all. But the idea was that you have a field. This could be viewed as a messy field, where very different sets of practices are, in fact, utilized. And what I was concerned in this paper was to say that some of these practices engage with the contemporary sciences of the scholar, okay? And some of these practices engage with, say, the contemporary science of the subject. And in the former case, there's all kinds of creative work that I don't have any problems with. In the latter case, what happens, again, in the sort of the present day situation of that scholar in relation. So it's sort of, so let me put it another way, it might be helpful. So Latour, and to an extent Fletcher, are actually very concerned, I think, to be able to address your question. Namely, they think there is something that you have to watch in the specificity of an occurrence and of a life, and the development of a life that's not predictable. So they are, in some sense, traditional humanists, in the sense that they want to be able to get away from a deterministic model. And so that's the final answer, or the beginning of an answer, is extremely careful work. So that's one of the exhilarating things about Arsich's book, is that her engagement with the manuscripts of Thoreau. So one thing she'll do, so one of the great readings she does is of a manuscript notebook which Thoreau's brother John started describing birds. And John apparently was dead set against classification of birds by species. He actually had he just thought that ruined the bird. The classification that was of interest to him was the specificity of this bird, Okay? So when he dies, he has this notebook. And so this is sort of Thoreau within an archival setting, even if it's just in the house they shared. So it turns out that Thoreau, after a couple of months of grieving, goes out with his brother's notebook and looks for the particular birds in order to continue the description. Okay? And that seems to me, I'm using it as a figure in a way, but that's sort of closer to what you're looking for than, so it's not something which one size fits all, but that the archive, and so she does a wonderful job with that. It's just that my complaint is that she isn't paying enough attention to then the interim, which includes from when she's writing to when he was working. And that this changes, because she actually does push in there all kinds of things in the interim, but the science is left out in the interim. Like I said, it's very hard for somebody who's not trained in specific scientific discourse and in particular experimental protocols. But that's what, in fact, the best people in literature and science. Again, you read this book, the Cambridge Companion. These are really fantastic scholars. And they describe both the difficulty involved and how one can begin to surmount it. Yes?
Two more questions.
Two more questions.
Thank you. I'm just going to press Catherine's point a little bit, because of course hard detailed work we're all in favour of. But the question for me, to go back to what I understand Catherine to be driving at as well, is you at one point you talk about ask you to say something that is attributing something to James, and you said actually it's not James. And then my question is, well, whose is whose? It's not James's, right? Well, whose is who? And also, who is James? That would absolutely stabilize the possession of this particular argument, or pinpoint it in the individual moment. I guess it's that.
Yeah. So here's a probably too facile beginning of an answer. So we all know how astonishingly and brilliantly ambiguous statements are, and that they can be read multiple ways, and sometimes you have writers who, in fact, engage with that multiplicity, and that's, in fact, the pleasure of the reading is to actually figure out how these different possibilities are all at play in various ways. But then you have, right, and if you feel that you're, in fact, engaging that, there's a certain sense that you're not just projecting, right? That you're somehow, and the last thing I would do is say James, but there's a corpus, there is an extended engagement of many hands, and so the question I was raising there is my impression as a James scholar, but I don't want to just, that's my card, no, but I'm just saying, is that shoehorning James into this list of philosophers, and then reading his texts a couple of times in the book, in ways that seem to suggest that he's thinking along the lines that she's proposing Thoreau is thinking, when there are many other readings that are possible. And this is probably an unlikely reading. That's the question. And part of it has to do with let's give you an example, the astonishing ambiguity of the term radical empiricism. So this is, as a phrase, is a phrase coined by James. There are similar phrases, but the phrase radical empiricism, as far as I know, comes off of his pen. Now, you ask philosophers about radical empiricism, you ask literary scholars about radical empiricism, and though they're likely, I think, still to think of that something along the lines of the Jamesian sense, the Jamesian sense being that empiricism traditionally emphasizes discontinuities among entities, sense data, specific data, and radical empiricism gives equal credence to the continuities among entities. That's what he had in mind by coining the phrase. But it is now a phrase that is, and there's very specific history. So again, part of it is actually trying to keep hold of this is the philologist in the contemporary scholar, trying to keep hold of these changes, so that at Harvard in the 1950s, the term started to be used in a different way, the phrase, radical empiricism. It was designed in this new sense to promote the quite rigid empiricism of the analytic philosophers at Harvard at the time, especially Quine. And the phrase was used to link the analytic philosophers to the most radical empiricist of all, Hume. Whereas James's coining of the term, of the phrase radical empiricism, was designed to take empiricism away from Hume. So it seems to me it is possible to make such claims. That is, we're not just, what do I feel is the meaning of this here? And it happens, again, I couldn't make the argument, but I could show you, it comes around the use of the term sensation, which Arsich is employing in a Deleuzean fashion. And in Deleuze, the term sensation means a lot more than the term means in sort of more rigid empiricist traditional formats. But it is not what James had in mind, even in the Deleuzean sense.
Just a brief comment on this is from secondary source about inaccessibility of Principia. That Newton was very afraid of getting into controversies with people who he thought did not understand his subject very well. And therefore, he says, I made Principia deliberately difficult to access for those who don't understand it very well. And I think he was referring to natural scientists, not probably so. That's it.
Please join us downstairs for the reception and join me in thanking Stephen Meyer.
Thank you, everybody. Great.